Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Thanks for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. I'm Nathan Kiker, along with my co-host George Bogdan. Our guest today is Nataliya Gumenyuk. She is a prominent Ukrainian journalist, documentary filmmaker, and author who's become one of the most influential voices in wartime governance and international justice. She is the CEO and founder of the Public Interest Journalism Lab and a co-founder of the Reckoning Project, Ukraine Testifies. Nataliya, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. All the best from Kyiv.
You recently took the bold step of filing a criminal lawsuit in Argentina under universal jurisdiction, I believe I saw. As a journalist, what did you see in the political gridlock of the ICC or the UN or other international organizations that convince you that we need to start looking towards the global south for justice?
So I probably would clarify that it happened in 2024.
Mm-hmm.
There was a very different environment, and I think it was harder for the Ukrainians to bring this idea that this is, the war against humanity. This is the unjust war, and this is not just kind of a Western war, So it was very important, especially in that specific case. We had people who survived horrible conditions under the Russian occupations, and in particular the cases of extreme tortures, electrocutions, and there is some horrific history of Argentina conducting the trials in the 80s. So there was a really positive example, and for us it was the case to show that because Argentina, the country, has a tradition that it's not just about, the West and Russia. But I probably should say today that we understand that it's a very different world we are in. And, like the US attitude towards war has changed a lot with the new administration. I'd probably clearly express myself. I think that they prefer to be seen as mediators rather than a Ukrainian ally. It's like not a secret. And in this regard, yes, maybe back then we were looking at a different jurisdiction complementary to the International Criminal Court. Today, including with everything which has happened after, with even the US sanctions against ICC, we also understand there should be also various places. And unfortunately, I should also say that, I see that the international justice so much dependent on policies and politics and the administrations. I fully entrust Argentina is a democracy. They have the independent prosecutions. But, so these things are still depend on the, on the government, on the political environment. So we are still there. I've learned myself as a journalist working with lawyers that it takes years and years. It's okay in the legal procedures, especially if they're connected to those kind of crimes connected in the context of the military conflict and at war.
I'm just wondering, do you think that there's any merit to some of the concerns expressed that sort of outstanding legal claims or, concerns about, ramifications of concluding the war, that those might be sort of barriers, or they might, create hesitation on either side for a resolution? Or, is there any downside to kind of launching this kind of case? Or?
I don't think so. I do think that there would be always a political will to, stay away and not to pursue justice. And it would be something which would be dropped quite often in a lot of other cases. While for the people like myself, for the journalists, for the people who are working with human rights, for the lawyers, it's actually our task not to push the topic of the justice from the international discussions, from the attempts to pursue this justice. And I bring a couple of examples. So first, on top of everything, we mainly work in Ukraine. We, documented hundreds and hundreds of the testimonies of the survivors. But on top of that, because in Ukraine it's already fourth year after the full-scale invasions, and some of the horrific crimes indeed happened like 4 years ago. So we continue to follow up with survivors, and we even organize the numbers of the meetings of the survivors with the local prosecutors, local policemen, because Ukraine is a huge country, and in fact most of the cases would be investigated in Ukraine, the cases of tortures, cases of murders, of the illegit attacks on the civilians. And in this conversation, often there would be a very simple village people from a very small towns you will never know. Even I, as a Ukrainian, would never heard of the image. But when they will sit together, both, let's say, like a local policeman from a small town, which is today, have to investigate the international crimes. We understood that for Ukrainians, it matters. It matters because they feel that the world should know is a part of the justice. Because they, in fact, fully understand that maybe not all the cases would be investigated. Not every person who probably killed somebody would be, especially speaking about the Russian military, that they would be in the court. But understanding that, it's even more important in this war of disinformation, with all the propaganda, with all those things, where crimes are erased from the public memories, where the truth is about to be, rewritten, and where there would be, unfortunately enough, people believing in a lot of kind of the conspiracy theories, even in the US, as we know, something I wouldn't expect maybe like a decade ago. So for the people, the fact that the world should know is so important, and it gives me the biggest motivation to like not to drop the story and still to tell the story internationally. And I also believe that in case, for instance, of Russia, I think it's a good exit strategy for Russia. Confronting and speaking, like there is a complicated relations, obviously, between not just I'm sorry, apology. So there are obviously Russia is fighting the war against Ukraine. There are a lot of Russian soldiers involved, but also there are the Russians who, let's say, opposing the government of Russia, who are abroad, and there are not easy relations between Ukrainians and the Russians in that regard. Those, let's say, liberal or so-called opposition Russians. And because they say, like, we are not all guilty, we are not enforced this war, it's a president we didn't vote. And I think it's also very important for the Russians themselves to understand then, okay, but then should be somebody guilty for a specific crime, for a specific destruction, for the use of the weapon which shouldn't be used, or for the things which are not really discussable, because we can debate whether this attack is this or that, but if it's really a serial tortures which are like conducted in a very specific way, we just know, like, you don't do that. So in that regard, I also believe that the justice, that we already have so many compromises. I think Ukraine is compromising all the time, because if we speak about the justice, what is justice? Justice in this regard would be, if you speak in kind of in moral terms, that would be, like the Ukrainian victory, and the perpetrators should be punished. We can say it's maybe naive and idealistic, and Ukrainians are not naive and idealistic. You really hear in all the discussion that Ukraine is making different types of the compromises. So it shouldn't be pushed to giving up even like the basic, and again, as I agreed, it's important for the Ukrainian people. It's important for the victims. It's as much as we can do, but also it's a good opportunity to Russia to say, like, no, it's not every Russian who is responsible for everything that's happened, but there were specific people, and we should identify them, and we should identify who was the man A to do that or to do this.
Tell us more about the victims, who you're representing, how many there are. You don't have to get into graphic detail, but specifically, what outcomes do they want to see from these actions?
So what we do is quite specific, because overall in the Ukrainian registry, an official registry, there are I would repeat, in quite a slow way, 230,000 cases which are registered as alleged types of the war crimes. It's insane kind of number, but we also know that it's more than real, because a lot of organizations which are conducting the research know that not everybody go to the police and not everybody record, what has happened. In our case, we do the in-depth interviews, the long talks, of just people who potentially survived the war crimes, and we have spoken for over 600 people. And in this regard, we are disproportionately looking a lot into the ones which is the hardest to get with the Ukrainian state. And these are the people who survived occupation, or who, like maybe they left the country, maybe they're even still concerned, they left later. So let's say roughly, which is not representative, but would say like half of our people are the people who live, most of them out today live in the Ukraine controlled territory, but half of them might be the victims of different types of the missile strike. And by the missile strike, I'm not meaning the, frontline explosions, but if it's somebody who lives in the big city, and was in the shopping mall, and that shopping mall was destroyed by the missile attack, and it's a rare city, it's not a frontline city, or the train station from where the evacuation had been happening, and there were the women, there were kids. So like those type of the obvious cases, or where there would be a rescue worker coming to the site of the attack in Kiev, and there would be the double strike, and there would be the ambulance worker or the firefighter who died under these circumstances. So the cases we look are quite straightforward, and probably half of them are also about the people who lived in the occupied territories, and they were a different reason taken without any explanation, and they would be tortured, they would be kept for some period of time. But we after years and years of working, we understand that like you can say they are random people, because you can speak about the place where there could be a teacher, a farmer, a student, and one would be Ukrainian, and one would be Christian, another evangelical. So like it's not just a political affiliation, but we learned that it's usually the people who are active members of their community. You're a teacher, you're a volunteer, you like kind of a communal leader, official or not. A village leader it's not exactly in Ukraine a politician. I think it's very simple, as in the US, it's an elected position. It's just somebody who deeply cared about the community, can be some kind of senior member, and these type of people for being active. As one of our survivors, I often refer to her quote. It was a wife of the survivor. She really said, in our town, it's a town in currently still occupied by Russia territory, it's enough to have own opinion to be detained. It doesn't mean what opinion you have. You can be right, you can be left, you can be, as I earlier said, of different political background. But the idea that you are not openly welcoming the Russian state is kind of meaning that probably you're a bit suspicious. So those people are very different, and it's a very philosophical discussion, because what we learned as well, people have different ideas about justice. For a lot of them, it's truth, it's identification of those who are guilty, it's a recognition, it's punishment, it's kind of some level of retribution, it's this international acknowledgement of what has happened. And by the way, what I was pretty much surprised talking to a lot of international lawyers, they usually bring the cases of a lot of other countries where there were horrible wars. They say that for a lot of people, it's kind of like some financial gains, retribution, that they need to return to the normal life. I see that less here in Ukraine. People kind of more ideological. They really think that the injustice has happened. Nothing would be returned to us. We know our house would be destroyed. I won't be able to return to my place. But it should be clear for everybody who is a perpetrator, what is black and what is white. I would kind of sum up it into that regard, into that domain.
Okay. You've argued that we need to treat these events as crimes and not just tragedies. I remember interviewing the mayor of Bucha 3 years ago in Ukraine, and he was making the same point. But help us understand that. How does that distinction change the way journalists are covering these stories in 2026 compared to 2022 when I interviewed the mayor of Bucha?
I think this, yes, I operate with this phrase, and it remains for me helpful, because I think if you think about the tragic events, and we report on a lot of tragic events, somehow you feel very much powerless. The world is unjust. Tragedies happen, and there is a tragedy after a tragedy. And then you kind of overwhelmed by the amount of those tragedies. I've given the number. But I feel, and I'm also trying to explain that for my team, and it works, if you really understand that, no, it wasn't a tragedy. It was not an accident. Yes, sometimes during the war, a person can die. A person could be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But very often, it's quite deliberate. It's like attack on the hospital. They knew what was there. They used that specific weapon, which, like targets not weaponry, but civilians. They did that at that time. So after years and years, you kind of understand that a lot of things are deliberate. Therefore, it's quite clear there was somebody who has taken this decision. There was somebody who has given order. And in this regard, you can say, like, I'm bringing, like, sometimes the most simple examples as I can, especially like when we have this moving to this idea about whether we can forget about those crimes. There is a very specific case of driving accident. And it could be a very good person who, by chance, unfortunately, due to some stupid circumstances, horrible circumstances, killed somebody in the traffic accident in a car. And I would never go there and say, like, this guy is good. He doesn't deserve to be punished. He did that. And that person has to be responsible. So why, if the crime is about death of 100 people, isn't like that? So I think for us it's helpful, but I also given today a bit of different example also, which I believe is also helpful to our reporters, to my team, saying that also while telling their stories, those survivors, they also change a bit the role, because they are not just the victims of the Russian soldiers. They are kind of like those who are telling the story in which the Russian soldiers are the bad characters.
I would love to ask, I do a lot of work on kind of the history of Ukraine-Russian relations, and I'm wondering, how do you look at the Budapest Memorandum and the insistence of the West that Ukraine give up its nuclear weapons?
So I would say that as somebody who looked into the case, I do understand that there were circumstances in 1994 where Ukraine couldn't act differently. Because there was international pressure, because there was inner pressure. One should also understand that Ukraine has become independent in 1991, but prior to that, we survived the Chernobyl nuclear attack. Environmental movement was very critical for the Ukrainian independence. The idea of the, denuclearization, like more or less like the environmental ideas, all the ideals about not having nuclear weapon, they were still there. So again, I would say that I would admit that the country probably had no choice rather than to act that way. But it's such a lesson for us, because I think what is also very important, we have three guarantors: Russia, UK, and the US, which also says that Ukraine has a full right to demand from the US and from the UK an expectation to give basic guarantees. But I probably would add something more while now looking very closely, to the Russian weapon. When you look at that, you're kind of shocked to know that Ukrainians were attacked from the very similar claims which Ukraine has given to Russia in 1994. So, for instance, this connection should be very clear. Ukraine, especially for the first years of the war, but till now, is regularly attacked by the different types of the missile strikes. To launch that missile strike, you sometimes need a specific jet, and that jet is carrying the nuclear strike which kills Ukrainians. And then you can identify that these are the same planes. And actually, during the quite famous Operation Spiderweb, which with the drones, the operation of the Ukrainian security service on the Russian airfields, you later understood. You didn't know whether it was the same, like jets, but it was the same type of the jets, Tu, and different types of the Soviet-produced Tupolev jets. And this would be, for me, even more, absolutely clear examples. Or, for instance, that some of the crew, some of the ships, some of the navy, which Russian took from Ukraine after 2014, when they annexed Crimea, they took them, and it's not just they own them; they also used them to launch the attack against Ukraine. So it sounds so sick, it sounds so cruel, it sounds so unfair that you really think like things are wrong. And I should say recently, I had a chance to just see some video, of the famous big Ukrainian TV channel. It's an archival footage from early 2000s, something like that, when the Ukrainians were destroying their jets, because it was a part of the program. And there was an American general in the airfield standing and observing that operation, because it was a part of that operation. And now, when Ukraine was asking the jets, and Ukraine was not given the jets, Ukraine has no jets. Ukraine is asking for the American Patriots also, partially because we don't have jets. For air defense, you need, today we have anti-drone interceptors, but you need to have some missile, like some kind of anti-missile systems. But jets would also work. So when you practically look that we attack from something we have given, it sounds, like even more sad, and it's even more unfair, because it was not symbolic. It was not just symbolic that somebody promised us not to attack us, or somebody promised us to defend, but they didn't deliver. But that specific kind of like very material part of that agreement is, of course, making a lot of Ukrainians don't trust any further agreements, or not just not to trust, but be very cautious about the future agreements.
You study Ukraine's population more than most. Are the reports we see about sort of war fatigue within Ukraine affecting how the war is actually conducted on the front lines?
We're in an interesting period. The fatigue is there. But, I also bringing a lot of like those examples. Like if you're sick, you maybe have some level of fatigue, but you continue your treatment. You don't give up. The same is like a rescue worker can't say like, oh, I'm tired. I go away from the site. And I do think this is kind of should be the mindset, like a doctor doesn't say I'm tired in between of the operation. And I do think for a lot of Ukrainians, for a lot of military, the thinking is this way. It's a luxury for us to kind of just walk away if you are tired. You need just to change your routine, to find the way, maybe to find somebody else who will help you. But I do think the situation is a bit better than it was a year ago and 2 years ago, if you speak about the front line. So, first of all, we did survive a very difficult winter. That is one thing. The second, military-wise, for the last couple of months, the Ukraine is in a bit stronger position than it used to be half a year ago, let's say like that. Ukraine kind of reached some level of parity because the war moved to the war of drones, and it's kind of, there is a specific balance. We are less dependent on specific military capacities, which we would, we knew that there would be lack. For the last year, Ukraine almost survived without the American help. But before, you needed to develop this capacity to substitute. So if it would happen like in a very, very surprising, let's say, way, that would be more catastrophic. But Ukraine started to prepare for that quite long time ago, and it brought some confidence. So now there are lacks of a lot of things. There are lacks of funds. There are lacks of, still there would be also the case of the lack of the air defense and a lot of other things. There are always not enough people, but also this is kind of worked out with the different use of technology, with permanently having less people. So the fatigue is there, but you clearly also understand that you have less partners to count. At the same time, you also see that in case of the Europeans, they are looking more reliable, way more reliable, which has been proven by actions, not exactly just by the words. It takes time for Europe to step in, but they partially did. I'm speaking more about the financial measures rather than a specific military capacities.
I don't think anything highlights this more than at the start of the Iran war, the European Union saying, hey, we'll meet on Monday to talk about this while bombs are going off on a Friday. But how long will the public in Ukraine allow for this war to go on? And does it matter under martial law, suspended elections?
So first of all, it's not the public who allows or not allows. It's Ukrainians who are defending themselves. So it's not the government who decide whether there would be war or there won't be the war. Ukrainians firmly believe that the only way to defend themselves. So it doesn't matter what Zelensky says. Let's say if you speak about the president, he just literally knows that in this regard he translates the views of the people. So far, the people haven't seen much of the desire from the Russian side to stop. Ukrainians were tricked a lot of time when behind the disguise of kind of so-called negotiations, Russia was just strengthening itself. So unless there is a kind of a genuine sign from Russia that they are ready to stop, and I probably would stress that last spring, Ukraine and the government indeed clearly said that, okay, let's go for the unconditional ceasefire. Let's go for unconditional ceasefire. Like for a couple of months, it was like the Ukrainian opera. We can stop, but just stop. If you stop, we will stop. But because I'm speaking about a very practical thing, not about like some vague idea about the war. At least let's speak about the stop of violence. That like no bombs are falling, no attacks are prepared. We also should say that the last year of 2025, was the deadliest year in terms of the attacks on the civilian objects, mainly also because Ukraine was lacking a number of the air defense capacities, which is a bit building. There were quite extremely intensive Russian attack. So the war intensified for the last year compared to how it used to be earlier. But the difference is that Ukraine developed the capacity to defend that. So I think for Ukrainians, the major task is really how you really do those Russian attacks, like in a way irrelevant. So they hurt least. Because I think for a lot of Ukrainians, the clear idea is like, it's not theoretic. It's like, is it threat to my life or it's not there? Do I feel I'm threatened or I'm not? And the answer is, Okay, but if it doesn't work with the words, do I have a capacity? They do not attack, or at least if they attack, I have a capacity to intercept, to stop, to defend, and or to create the situation in which the harm, my harm to me, my city, or wherever, is the least. And that's why the question should be probably more like how long Ukrainians would be ready to defend themselves. I do think for quite some time, unless they feel threatened.
I think it'd be good to end, on your objections about, the land for peace, right? Because constantly in the West, we hear proposals about this, and if you just have a kind of presses or like a brief kind of explanation, because it's very helpful, for us to hear that, right?
There is the Ukrainian position, and there is something I'd like to speak about from the Russian position. So, from the Ukrainian position, of course, the land the Russians control is used for further militarization, for having more soldiers, including the Ukrainian children who live there and growing up in that territory to become the future soldiers to attack Ukraine. Everything they grabbed before was used as the playing ground for further and even bigger attack. So there is a specific risk of not just Ukrainians not being capable to live under the horrible circumstances on the Russian occupation. So for me, it's first of all, there are like a moral dimension whether I would subject the Ukrainian civilians to live under these horrible things when anybody can be, kidnapped, tortured, but also for the militarization of those territories, because we do see that like the kids which were in Crimea today are sent to fight against Ukrainians, and the mobilization in the territories occupied a bit later is used to force the Ukrainian men to fight in the Russian army. But that's one thing. The second, we never heard from Russia, if it's not about the talk maybe to the President Trump, that it's enough for them. They never said it. Their goals are political. They want the regime change in Kiev. They want the pro-Russian puppet government in Kiev. So they need just this territory. This territory doesn't matter for them, to be honest. They don't know the names of those towns. Those towns are often indeed are destroyed. They need them as a military base. They physically need them as a military base. And I think it's like what they now demand. It's very important to understand what they now demand. They now demand for Ukraine willingly to give away the land they haven't conquered. They hadn't been able to take military-wise for the 12 years, and especially for the couple of last years. The whole fight is happening in the eastern Ukraine, not elsewhere. So with all their might, with the thousands of people, with probably like 1,000 Russians dying every day, they are not capable to conquer the land. Why the hell somebody would give that land if they just ask? So somebody's coming to kind of conquer something with a weapon and is not capable, and then say like, oh, please, President Trump, help me just to give it, because these guys, I cannot conquer them. And this is quite a weird debate, because it's really not a debate even about freezing. Because if there would be the debate about freezing, we can say like, stop fighting, ceasefire. What is for me striking in this discussion, that the idea of the ceasefire, the most basic idea, because how people, any international person, imagine what is the stop of the war? It's when there are no guns, when there is no shelling. That's okay. I understand it logical. Can you imagine imminent freeze? But that's not what discussed. The request is to give us away and then something else. And I know it's a long conversation, but I think where is the problem with these negotiations? In the physics, there is this law of connected vessels. And I think the problem is that Russians see compromises or concessions as a signs of weakness. So as long as somebody agrees for minor concessions, they understand, they are in the weak position. Let's ask something else. And then they ask something which is which is crazy. And then you don't agree for that. And then you return to the initial communication. And then Ukrainians again agree on something. And they say like, oh, it looks like they're weak again. So anytime Ukraine even is ready for some kind of compromise, they're asking something, and their request is growing. And therefore, it's very hard to deal, and therefore, it's partially these concessions, these discussions is like leading to more or less nothing.
Yeah. Nataliya, you have generously given us more than 30 minutes of your time. For our listeners, where can they continue to follow your work?
Oh, so if I write something like longer, like any piece for the international publication, and I do write, there is my Twitter @n like Nataliya and Gumenyuk, my surname, which you probably will see in the title of the podcast. That would be the easiest to find. And if there is something kind of really substantial, because I do a lot of smaller things, that will be there.
Awesome. Thank you again for the time, and we'll be sure to have you on again in the future. Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time and share it with your friends.